Let's go to Dr. John Lee. He's a former professor of pathology and a former NHS consultant pathologist. And he joins us now. Good morning to you.
Good morning.
Whenever I talk to a politician, they'll just say the important thing is we have to save lives. But of course, there is ample evidence now, and you were writing about this very early on in the pandemic. That, in fact, you were one of the people that persuaded me that lockdowns were wrong, because looking at the statistics that you put forward, that lockdowns can actually end up costing, and Tier 3 is a version of lockdown. Lockdowns can actually cost more lives than they save.
Well, I think that's right. I mean, the thing is, no country has ever improved the health of its citizens by making itself poorer. Health tends to track pretty carefully GDP. One of the things that your previous guest just said really struck me. He came out with this statement that if we didn't lock down, despite the economic consequences of lockdown, that the economic consequences of not locking down, by implication because the virus is so awful, would be much worse. Now, that is something that was originally said in March when we knew nothing about the virus and people were worrying about a case fatality rate of 3.5% for this virus. Yeah. The thing is, to say that now totally flies in the face of what we know about the virus. It's totally without an evidence base. And frankly, if that's the level of the government's decision-making process, keeping on with ideas that date from the beginning of this pandemic and not having changed them in the view of the evidence, I mean, it beggars belief, frankly.
And that's the worry. And this is not saying, oh, this virus is a hoax, or it doesn't exist, or it's not deadly. It is. But the point is, it's about getting things in proportion, isn't it?
The point is that the statistic that really sums it up for the UK is that the average age of death with coronavirus at 82 and something is 14 months higher than the average age of death from all causes. So when we look back on this entire period, the coronavirus epidemic will have had zero effect on life expectancy.
It's not anything that would be particularly noticeable in any other normal year. We've had plenty of years in the last 20 years when we've had higher rates of deaths than this. And again, no one talked about locking down.
Yes, I mean, these are numbers that actually are in the public domain on the Office of National Statistics website. I mean, the figures for deaths go back 27 years. We hear a lot about comparing numbers to the last 5 years, but actually, when you look at the last 5 years out of the last 27, they have been below average death years. So, in fact, doing this 5-year average thing that people go on and on about in the government statistics, the 5-year average emphasises this epidemic more than it would do because the last 5 years have been below average. So what that means is that was a sort of an overhang, if you like, of very elderly people who hadn't been carried away by flu in those last 5 years because we haven't had particularly bad or other diseases in those years, who were waiting to be carried away by the next big thing, and it happens to have the name COVID on it. The question is, what's the proportion of this thing? Is this out of proportion to anything we've ever experienced before, or is it within the envelope? And it's clearly, absolutely clearly within the envelope.
Okay,
so there is no justification.
But a lot of people will be saying, well, hold on a minute, you can say that, Dr. John Lee, with all your expertise and years of experience, but the rest of the world is locking down as well. We've seen, Germany, France, lots of other democracies are making exactly the same decision as us. Why are they doing that, and why shouldn't we?
Well, it's funny, isn't it? So there we are. On the issue of Brexit, all the European countries can be at loggerheads forever, as far as I can see, arguing about this. But on the issue of coronavirus, they're like sheep. They seem to think that as long as they all stick together, none of us will spot the fact that they're doing the wrong thing. Essentially, there's no leadership in politicians. What they've all done is gone and hide behind the political sofa so that nobody can blame them for getting anything wrong about something which they clearly, absolutely clearly do not understand. And unfortunately, what we're stuck in now is that the narrative that the governments have come out with, rather than the obvious way of approaching this virus, which is to shield the vulnerable and let the working age population get on with their lives. And it's incredible, isn't it, to hear Chief Minister of the Treasury arguing that the economic damage of stopping all working age people working pretty much is less than actually letting working age people who are not affected by this virus on the government's own numbers carry on with their work. I mean, how can that possibly be a rational thing? But in terms of the governments keeping together, they're all sticking together on this narrative. And the narrative that they've made up is that the way out of jail is for a vaccine to work. Now, I think there are serious reservations about a vaccine working either very effectively or long term or in most people. But the fact is, because the government has decided that that's the way out, that narrative, I believe, will be made to work, again, irrespective of the evidence. So I sort of despair, really. Rational discussion has had very little place in the whole management.
John, I've been despairing for quite some time. I mean, the key thing is, of course, we know we're going into winter, we're going to see respiratory diseases going up. We know that's going to happen. Everyone could have predicted that. But we're not seeing, again, there's virtually no flu. I mean, flu has basically disappeared. Coronavirus is now the respiratory disease of choice, effectively. if when we coming through January, we're told there's going to be a spike in January, as there usually is this time, that sort of time of year, as we come out of that, we're going to be told that it's been the lockdown and the restrictions that have forced down infection rates, and it's been government action that has saved us all. That's going to be the narrative, isn't it?
Yeah, well, it will be. And of course, what they're doing, of course, is conflating, and you touched on this earlier, they're conflating a positive test result with a case. And that is a completely non-medical thing to do. And the fact that SAGE can go along with that, frankly, I think calls into question the impartiality and the validity of their advice. The fact is, a case is somebody with symptoms who is ill enough to present to the health services. A positive test, if we did positive tests for the common cold every winter, we'd have millions of cases and we could generate the same hysteria as we are about coronavirus. A positive test is not a case. As you say, 99, a vast proportion of the cases are symptomatically negative. These are people who are not more incapacitated by this illness than they are by any normal cold, and we should carry on with life as normal, like we do normally with normal colds, while helping vulnerable people to shield. I mean, it's pretty much a no-brainer on the basis of the evidence. And in fact, when a study that was published in the Lancet a few weeks ago did a correlation between the incidence of the virus per 100,000 population on the y-axis versus across the severity of the lockdown measures. And the fact is, when you look at the effect that lockdown measures have on the incidence, it's a scatter diagram. There is no correlation.
No, and that's the key thing. Just finally, very briefly, we're well over time, but I don't care because I love talking to you, John. And I think a lot of my listeners would be just cheering at the radio to hear someone sane talk about the stuff who's actually got qualifications in this field. Is that we're told, this rather scary mutant new variant of the virus. Matt Hancock chose to lead with that last night when he was talking about the tier 3 restrictions. Obviously, that's on the front page of virtually every newspaper. All of the journalists asking, when are we locking down for Christmas? Why are we having 5 days off for Christmas? What about how scary is this new virus? A study done by people who know what they're talking about, University College London's Genetics Institute, looking at more than 46,500 people with COVID from 99 countries across the world. They found that they identified more than 12,700 mutations of COVID. Can I point out here, I'm sure you'll agree, mutation of COVID it would be weird if it wasn't mutating rather than the other way around. Is there anything to be frightened of with this new mutation?
I very much doubt it. I mean, I think this is an example of psychological operations again. They're trying to manipulate people's behaviour by waving a shroud in front of them. And this mutant is a clear example of the government taking a random piece of information and trying to frighten people with it. I mean, it's a disgrace, really. The fact is, as I wrote about in April in The Spectator, this virus will mutate. The more we let the virus spread around, the more likely it is to mutate to an easily spread-aroundable version of itself, which is less lethal. So in fact, letting it spread, letting asymptomatic cases spread, means we're more likely to get more cases which are asymptomatic. We should let people get back to their normal lives and let this virus do its thing. We'll all end up in the same place anyway. The question is, will it be after 1, 2, 5, 10 or 15 lockdowns, or will we see sense and just get back to normal and let the virus do its thing and live with it, which we will have to do?
Put John Lee in charge, everybody. Thank you very much, Dr. John Lee, former professor of pathology and NHS consultant.